What is up, guys? Marcellus Williams, aka TheSwolefessor, here to educate you on health, fitness, social well-being. Today, guys, we're talking about the proper utilization of isolation movements.
I am the greatest.
Someone with power. Someone with power. Someone with dash. Someone with power.
Alright, guys, so before we get into this topic, I just want to start off by saying that for those of you who've been asking, yes, I am going to start going over different pieces of weightlifting equipment as far as lifting belts, straps, knee sleeves, knee wraps, everything like that. Originally, I planned to maybe do a video over all of them at once, but then I realized that wouldn't be very thorough and it would be just too long of a video. So what I'm gonna do is probably go over one piece of equipment a week. So if you all would just leave in the comments down below which piece of equipment you'd like for me to go over first, just go ahead and do that for me. I really appreciate it. Basically, I'll just be going over the pros and cons of each piece of equipment, who should be using what piece of equipment, if you should be using a piece of equipment at all, based upon your goals and circumstances, etc. And then I'm also, guys, gonna be going over, by popular request, pretty soon, just different movements that you either want to make sure you adjust or maybe even avoid altogether in order to avoid, injury, especially in elbow, in areas like the elbows, the knees, etc. So a lot of people have been asking me to go over that. Now, with that being said, to the topic at hand, proper utilization of isolation movements. So a lot of you who've been following me for a while already know that I'm really big on basing your program around compound movements, and that while yes, isolation movements have their place, that any program or routine that has you doing far more isolation movements than compound movements is something you may want to be wary of, just for the mere fact that compound movements are always going to give you more bang for your buck, not just in the sense that you're hitting multiple muscle groups at once, but also in the sense that you're going to be able to load each specific muscle group involved in that movement far more than on an isolation movement. And I understand the misconception that a lot of people have is that if I want a specific muscle to grow more, then I should isolate it, right? Why? Well, because if I do a compound movement, then the other muscles are going to take away from the muscle I'm trying to focus on. And that's simply not the case, guys, with most compound movements. Like in my pull-up video, which I'll link in the description down below, where I gave you a full tutorial and breakdown of pull-ups and chin-ups as far as the muscles involved, how different grip hand placements affect what, overhand versus underhand, etc. I explained to you all that as far as how far your hands are on a pull-up, that there is no difference in lat activation, none whatsoever. The only difference is that the closer your hands are, the more your biceps are involved. The further apart they are, the less the biceps are involved. But the back is still equally engaged, right? So in that instance, if we're going just for overall hypertrophy, it would make more sense to go closer. Why? Because you're getting the most bang for your buck. The back's getting stimulated the same regardless, and the bicep's gonna get some extra work. So, and the fact is, guys, with things like a chin-up, research and studies have shown that the chin-up stimulates the bicep just as much as what a curl does. So this mindset that, oh, if I really want a muscle to grow, I have to isolate it, isn't necessarily the case, guys. It's just not. The reality is the same thing like with the bench press. A lot of people have the mindset that, okay, if I go wider, that's gonna emphasize my chest more. No, that's not the case, guys. You're taking your tricep out of the movement, so your triceps are emphasized less, but you're not working the chest anymore. If anything, you're working the chest a little bit less. Why? Well, the wider you go, the shorter the range of motion, whereas the closer you are, the longer the range of motion, the longer the stretch is gonna be on the chest, and therefore you're gonna get more growth and development from a normal, traditional, bench grip versus going extremely wide. So just think about it that way, guys. You have to understand how biomechanics work and then just how our muscles work on a physiological level. With that being said, I am not anyone who's anti-isolation movements or, oh, you should never do isolation movements. Not at all. Isolation movements definitely have their place, and that's what this video is all about, pretty much explaining when you should be using them. So once again, guys, going back to that video I did over the principle of specificity, understand that isolation movements pretty much are going to be your accessory work. Now, that's not to say that accessory work automatically equals isolation movements. And what I mean by that is, for example, let's say that my main focus is increasing my bench press, right? Any movement that I do as an accessory to the bench press itself, or any variation I do of the bench press itself, is an accessory movement to help increase my overall bench. For example, overhead press, standing barbell overhead press is a compound movement, but I can use that as an accessory movement to my bench press to help increase my bench press. So isolation doesn't automatically equal accessory, or rather accessory doesn't automatically equal isolation movements, but isolation movements are great accessory movements depending on what your goals are. So the first thing I want you guys to understand is that as a beginner, someone who's in their first year of lifting, as far as overall hypertrophy, you're not really going to get any benefits from isolation movements. So what I mean by that is all the studies have shown that if we take somebody who does just compound movements, right, and then someone who does isolation movements and they're in their first year, doing the isolation movements doesn't stimulate much more growth. For example, if we have someone who's doing curls in their first year and somebody who's just doing a bunch of heavy rows and pulls but no curls, you're not going to see much different in terms of their overall bicep growth. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't do isolation movements as a beginner, because the reality is eventually you are going to start getting benefits from those isolation movements, right? As you get, out of your first year more to the intermediate and eventually advanced levels, you're gonna start to see which muscle groups on you specifically may be lagging muscle groups, and that's when those isolation movements will come in handy. So if you start working on the isolation movements early in your beginner phases, even though they may not help you with much as far as hypertrophy, then you're gonna already be relatively strong on those movements for when they are gonna be beneficial. For example, if I realize that, let's say I realize that, oh man, my tricep is a lacking muscle group. Well, and I'm out of my first year. Well, the reality is, if I've already been working on tricep extensions and press downs, I'm already gonna be stronger on those movements. Therefore, doing 3 sets of 10 with, say, 100 pounds is gonna give way more stimulation to my triceps than maybe doing 3 sets of 10 with 50 pounds, because that's all I can do because I've never utilized the movement before, right? So I'm not telling you as a beginner not to use isolation movements. It's just understanding what the benefit actually is. Focus on getting stronger on that movement, but don't think that doing a bunch of extra isolation work in your first year is really gonna help bring anything up. And that's the thing, guys. Understand that as a beginner, you don't have any weak points. In the nicest way possible, I've said this before, all of you is weak. Like, you have to build that base on your body as a whole. So, as far as isolation movements, that's what you kind of want to base it off. You utilize isolation movements kind of based off what your lacking muscle groups are, or if it has specific carryover to a bigger movement that you want to focus on. For example, if somebody, let's say that somebody's triceps are lagging, right? Then yeah, of course, doing some extra tricep work can be beneficial, but you want to be smart as far as what tricep work you're doing. For example, if you're doing a lot of bench press, incline dumbbell press, weighted dips, just a lot of pressing motions, well then doing some tricep press downs for the sake of growth anyway probably isn't going to be that beneficial. Why? Well, because you already gotten probably more than enough stimulation in your triceps as far as from all the pressing. The only thing that might be lacking a little bit may be the long head of your tricep. Why? Well, because even though we can't isolate the head of a muscle, like we can isolate muscle but not the heads of it, the reality is all heads are activated when we're pressing, but the long head tends to get the least amount of stimulation when we're pressing unless we're doing some type of overhead press. So that's why maybe if you do some type of tricep work, you want to do some overhead tricep work. Why? Because that's going to stimulate the long head of the tricep a lot more versus doing a type of press down, which is going to get the other two heads, which aren't going to need as much stimulation. So be smart as far as what you pick as far as your isolation work. Or for example, if somebody's already doing a lot of heavy chin-ups and rows, like close grip rows and pulls and things like that, well then maybe for your curls, you want to do things that are going to focus more on the outer head and not so much on the peak. So you're going to do things like dumbbell hammer curls or rope cable curls, things like that. So be smart in the utilization of your isolation movements. Now, with that being said, let's say that you want to use the isolation movement not because you care about bringing that muscle group up, but because you wanted to have carryover to a bigger movement. That's where different things can come in handy. For example, like tricep press downs. That can come in handy for helping you with your bench, especially if the tricep is the weak area in your bench. Why? Well, because if the tricep is the weak area in your bench, getting your tricep stronger is going to help that, and isolating your tricep in that way can be beneficial to it. But you got to be smart about it. Like, it doesn't make any sense for me to be like, hey, I want to increase my bench press and I'm doing leg extensions as an isolation movement. Like, what does that have to do with increasing my bench press? Yes, there is leg drive involved with the bench press, but doing leg extensions is not going to have direct carryover to increasing my bench. So you want to be smart about it in that way too. And that's why in a lot of my programs, guys, you guys will see that if like, well, for those of you who order programs from me, that when you've given me specific muscle groups that are lagging that you want to work on, that's what your isolation work is based around, those lacking muscle groups. For those of you who aren't really sure, I kind of give you a balance of isolation movements. You're not going too hard on any one particular isolation movement, because that's the thing that people don't understand, guys. Most of the time when people get different like injuries in terms of like, oh man, my elbows hurt a lot or my knees hurt a lot, things like that, a lot of people have this mindset that it comes from, oh, your compound movements, oh, you're locking out on your bench press, which I've already done videos over, guys. You guys already know the misconception and myth behind that, or oh, you shouldn't be locking out on your squats because you're hurting your knees, things like that. That's not the case, guys. More often than not, what happens is people do an excessive amount of isolation work where you're just, just a bunch of tricep press downs, a bunch of leg extensions. As I've explained in past videos, all that pressure that's going on the joint and the tendon because you're isolating the muscle in that way is gonna cause damage, build up scar tissue over time. And then when you go to something like a bench press or a squat and you do lock out, you feel pain and you think, oh, it's from this movement. No, it's a buildup of what you've been doing with the isolation movements. You're just feeling the pain on that compound movement now because you're putting a heavier load on it. Because you guys have to remember, the body was made to work as one unit. Very rarely are there things that we do in our everyday life where we're just isolating a muscle group like that. So too much excessive isolation movements can be bad for the joints, for the tendons. That's just how it is. People don't like to think that way, don't like to accept it, because they're like, oh, but this bodybuilder does, like 100 sets of curls and tricep press downs. And I've already explained to you guys that when you're a natural athlete, you cannot compare yourselves to these high-end level bodybuilders when a lot of them unfortunately are on drugs, and the reality is what works for them isn't even necessarily going to work for you, and regardless, they may not have as much repercussions as what you're going to have. Why? Because they don't have to worry about recovery as much as what we do. So just keep that in mind as well, guys. With that being said, there's nothing wrong with isolation movements. Like I said, I'm not dogmatic against it. I'm just trying to explain to you guys how to have proper utilization of it. Know what your goals are. Like I said with anything, know why you're doing a specific movement. That's the whole point of the principle of specificity. Know why you're doing something. Okay, if your biceps are great, if your biceps are huge, then you have to ask yourself, okay, like, why am I doing like 5 different types of curls? What's the point of that? Like, why are you doing that? Is this to have some carryover to a different movement to get you stronger, or are you trying to stimulate more growth? Because remember, guys, diminished returns doesn't just work, you know, from year to year. The more you work out, it also works in the session. The first few movements you do in a workout, guys, are going to give you the most benefit. Why? Because the longer you work out, the more tired you're going to get, the more fatigue you're going to get, and as such, you're going to get diminished returns in that session. You're not going to be able to perform as well on the 5th curl exercise you do if you already did several back movements that involve your biceps and then 4 other curl movements before that. You start to get diminished returns to the point where it's like, okay, why am I even doing this? So just keep that in mind, guys. It's important to understand that isolation movements are just a tool. They're not a necessity by any means. Now, let's address a few things. With some cases, you are gonna have to isolate the muscle. Like for example, unless you're genetically blessed, you're gonna have to isolate your calves. You're gonna have to do standing calf raises, seated calf raises, because they're not gonna grow the way you want if you don't do that. Same thing with, like, you know, with your medial delts, like lateral head delt. Not that it doesn't get stimulation from different compound movements, like especially if you do, like, you know, behind the neck presses or things like that. But the reality is, if you're not doing side lateral raises, you're gonna notice an imbalance between the 3 heads of your delts. Why? Well, because our front delts get plenty of stimulation when we're pressing. Our rear delts, even if you don't hit them directly, which I definitely recommend that you do, maybe once or twice a week, but if you don't hit them directly, whenever you're doing a bunch of pulling motions, your rear delts are gonna get developed. But the medial delt just doesn't get as developed from those compound movements. From something like side lateral raises, twice a week, that makes sense. So once again, it's all about understanding and distinguishing, okay, why am I doing this movement? Is this a lagging muscle group? Is this actually gonna help me? Don't have this mindset that isolation movements are something you have to do, because they're simply not. And that's pretty much it, guys. This isn't a very, like, you know, in-depth scientific video. It's really almost more of common sense. Once you understand, you know, the principles that we've talked about in past videos, it really makes sense to apply it to this and understand that, okay, yeah, I don't necessarily have to do leg extensions, leg curls, tricep press downs, curls. I don't have to necessarily isolate every muscle group. Now, I will say more often than not, people tend to go about it backwards. And what I mean by that is you'll see people doing way more leg extensions than they maybe are doing leg curls. That doesn't make sense. Why? Because most people are quad dominant. Most people don't work the posterior chain enough. So if anything, you want to do more isolation work for that, your lower back, your hamstrings, your calves, all of that. But that's pretty much it, guys. That's it for the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment down below. Let me know that you did. If you did not enjoy it, leave a comment down below, letting me know what I can do to get better. Like the video, share, subscribe. Keep it simple, specific, scientific. I'll catch y'all later.
I am the greatest.
Someone look